what happens when your legacy, that's all that you've done, all that you've talked about, all that you have viewed and the perspectives you have taken, collides with the truth. Another way of putting it, what happens when your actual behavior comes into stark contrast with the narrative or the stories that have been created around you. Hi, I'm Dr. G.L. White, and welcome to the Dr. G.L. White Show. Today, we're going to talk about something that I think a lot of people in the media has been tiptoeing around, and that is the discussion of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, which occurred on September 10th in Utah, an all-white place at a all-white university, assassinated by a white individual. But we have to have a conversation of what took place immediately following that. The first person to make a comment about that was Jimmy Kimmel, and immediately Kimmel was taken off the air up to a certain point because he spoke of this person who somehow became a national hero, but he was removed, and the initial label was indefinitely. But when you really begin to think about it, what happened and how America responded to Charlie Kirk in some ways was very similar to the OJ trial, split right down the middle. So many people were taking this position of honoring him and recognizing him almost to the point of viewing him as a martyr. While on the other hand, the target of this white nationalist argument in his vein of descriptions of African-American communities and other minorities is something that we could not necessarily get around. Now, no one deserves to be killed. No one deserves to be assassinated, especially in the manner to which he has been killed. But that's not what I want to give a little attention to. I want to take my time to talk about in this moment that what happens when your legacy, that's all that you've done, all that you've talked about, all that you have viewed and the perspectives you have taken, collides with the truth. Another way of putting it, what happens when your actual behavior comes into stark contrast with the narrative or the stories that have been created around you. So we have to, in this moment, just explore some of the discomfort that comes with honoring this individual and the controversies that surrounded his death, and wrestling a little bit about how these inconsistencies really kind of tore the country apart in many situations. From NFL, where they wanted to pause for a moment of silence, to the news and casters recognizing we have to be honest about having this conversation. So I want to really look at this. Now, the first thing, when I really began to think about his assassination, I got to wrestle with these issues. And these, again, are just some things that I struggled with as I heard it. And I believe many of you found yourself wrestling as well. First, honoring the person, ignoring the harm. They wanted to honor him. They want to recognize his commitment. They want to highlight how he was a media influence, and they wanted to pay all these great tributes to him and talk about his passion and his commitment to engaging young people and getting him involved. The death also sanitized this legacy. And what I'm wrestling with here is that all these things that they talked about, but we know what he said about minorities. We know we could not avoid listening to him say that if I get on an airplane and I see it's a black pilot, I can't help of whether or not thinking that this is a DEI hire, and the arguments about intellectual deficiencies around certain groups. You can't avoid that perspective, but we've got to honor it and recognize it. Also, what we saw and what we began to recognize as well is how the media began to rewrite the narrative of this individual. Now, I struggled here, right? Because the TV stations and the politicians, they praise him for his impact on the youth and the lives that he transformed. And at the same time, the voices once critiqued his extreme views are now honoring him and recognizing him. Many of the same, even elected officials, staunch Democrats, were pausing to recognize and honor him. And so that should have caused some level of conflict even within ourselves as we listened to this. So the public shifted from a problematic person to a patriotic person. So rewriting the narrative, and anyone who studies family therapy and understand narrative or narration, we understand the power of a single story. We understand that a narrative, when you rewrite it and then can restructure the way people think and see it, and that's what we do in therapy. We're going to use narrative family therapy. We are going to look at the stories that individuals tell themselves, and we recognize the challenge that we have to do as a therapist working with an individual from this perspective is that we've got to help them change their narrative. Because if we can change their narrative, we can change their belief, and if we can change their belief, we can change their behavior. So we understand the significance of the narrative. But what the media did was problematic, because what the media did in their effort, they began to act as if all that we witnessed, the same critiques and the things that they've identified about him, somehow, because of his death, was instantly removed. And many of the arguments is related to what I call the he meant well justification, somehow trying to make a case or an argument for the vile things that he said, that he had good intentions. And someone was expected to believe this. Right? So this posthumous praise that they gave of him, they reframed him to be someone that we just simply misunderstood, that he was not harmful. But that did not coincide with what we were experiencing. This is the cognitive distortion that we began to see, seeing his intent as more important than his impact. But make no mistakes, before that assassination, or killing, before that significant event, we know what was being said. As a matter of fact, the last thing he responded to is that someone from the audience asked him, "What are your thoughts about mass shootings?" And moments before his death, he said, "Does that include gangs?" Now let that sit on you. Let that marinate for a moment. Because his response, as instinctive and as automatic as it was, we knew in that moment before his passing what the argument that he was about to make. So the social media platform, or I call them the echo chambers, right? These were the things that they began to say. The platforms began to flood him with this hero worship, or marking him as some type of martyr, just bypassing all that we've seen, arguing that the complex truths were somehow buried in this viral sympathy that people began to show for him. And so like does not equal legacy. Let me say that again. The like, or his life, does not equal legacy. But this is the reality that we're confronted with. These are the challenges that we see that reached a point that people were afraid, and everyone had the absolute right to be afraid to respond or make a negative comment, or what would be perceived as a negative comment, but I'm gonna call it a truth. That we saw that the days following his death, anyone said anything that remotely identified as a negative connotation, then there was a swift institutional, structural, and systemic response, or should I say reaction, right? So to speak up meant surely political use of death. That's right. It meant to speak up, you are somehow almost committed political suicide if you made any comment other than recognizing his what they refer to as his legacy. So leaders use his death to reinforce his agenda. We began to see that, and it was troubling for me, because even our very own president of these United States began to immediately blame a population that had nothing to do with it. This is the Democrats that done it. And following that stream, and here was the most interesting thing about the political use of death that blew my mind. I'm a professor, and I teach at an HBCU. Several historically Black colleges and universities received death threats. As a matter of fact, we were in a faculty meeting and we received the alerts from the university of the potential of an active shooter on campus, and we all went into lockdown following this death. Now, at this point, you are probably saying, well, what the hell did historically Black colleges and universities have to do with this? That's my point. We were looking at it, but somehow, remember I said about the narrative? Somehow it got changed and became a matter of the narrative. So these challenges, right, that the legacy of Charlie Kirk somehow became the fuel or the tool that others use to further his pontification, to further his views and his values, and to follow that by active vandalism and violence. So, but that's not the truth. What they began to make and the arguments they were making, and somehow these populations who became victimized immediately following his behavior somehow had something to do with it, right? So it resulted in what we could almost call an emotional whiplash. That's that immediate reaction that the public began to show toward anyone who spoke up. So many wrestled with this, like killing a man, but rejecting the message, right? That we rejected the fact that they killed him, but don't worry about the message because what that happened to him. Yes, I'm going to agree that the assassination of anyone, whether it's Charlie Kirk or Martin Luther King, the assassination of anyone is tragic. But that does not say rewrite the legacy, right? So this was the discomfort that we began to see and witness that led to this extreme narrative, all good or all bad. So we were founding ourselves because of this emotional whiplash of his death, is that we had to make a choice that either Charlie Kirk was all good or he was all bad. But to speak of him immediately following that came with repercussions. So we had to do what? We have to engage in silent dissent, right? And silent grief and silent frustration. That's what you had to do, because to speak up in any other way, we know that there were repercussions. So critics were told, now's not the time. That was the message. Now's not the time to talk about his message. Now's not the time to talk about his behavior. We must mourn his death. And we must then pause to acknowledge him. If I were an NFL player and I saw them pause to give a moment of reflection, I would find myself almost doing what Colin Kaepernick did. He took a knee. That was a knee taking, not for the death of this individual, but because of the legacy that he's left behind. But when is the right time to unpack the truth? That's the real question. When someone says now's not the time to engage in this, but when? And that's an honest question, because we saw a leader of this country immediately move and swift. Remember, you all, just a few days before his death, they politicized a woman who was on the bus who got killed by an individual, and immediately following that, it was used as a justification to bring the National Guard into that city. And so I'm simply saying that we have to kind of practice what we preach. So there's a myth making over this reflection that I'm struggling with, right? We created and painted this wonderful myth about this individual, right? The urge to create a clean story or to overshadow the need for an honest reckoning of this man's behavior. So I don't run from it. Legacy without accountability is just branding. And that's all they were done, is that immediately rushed to brand this individual. So those of you who want to speak up, those of you who want to say something, I just got some simple recommendations on how we do it, because the conversation needs to be had. Number one, I'm going to tell you, know the environment that you're in before you speak. Have some sense of awareness who's around you, some sense of awareness of their position or their perspective, right? Assess your workplace, your social circles, your online platforms. I'm going to tell you, pause and do an honest assessment of that before you speak up. Use questions instead of statements. I tell my doc students a lot of time, when you get your PhD, that means not that you have mastered the art of the understanding, but you've mastered the art of asking great questions. And so pose your concerns in the form of questions. Ask thoughtful, reflective questions that can challenge the narrative without triggering a type of defensiveness that we're going to see in some circles. Also, speak from lived experience, not your opinion. Right? It's always let me rephrase that. You can always defend your personal experience or your personal reflections. It's hard to dismiss or critique or the characteristics or of how you characterize a particular experience that you've had related to this type of language and communication that we've heard before this man's assassination. I'm going to tell you too, to leverage your private conversations. Sometimes your influence is stronger in small groups than there are in larger groups. So these are just some fundamental recommendations that I want you to kind of chew on, right? And then we all talk in codes. So use the coded language, the cultural language in certain settings, because you never know anyone's perspective, especially in the workplace. We have to be honest about it, but stay grounded in your principles, not personalities. You know, this depth does not change your perspective, your personalities, or your beliefs. And I think these are all critical in what we do, because we have seen in Charlie Kirk's situation that the social media became a strategy. And what I'm saying is that in many situations, everything that we've seen here is the exact type of thing that we see, you all, in our own community. It's a story that gets rewritten, that someone has died in gang-related crime, or someone has died breaking into a home and have gotten killed, and then automatically we start rewriting the narrative. So what we saw there, once again, we see in our own community. But these are the challenges of reconciling our legacy with our life. And I think those two things are important for families, for what we teach our children, that people, what you say and what you see, have to complement one another. And so this is my take on Charlie Kirk. This is my take on what we see in society and how society responds. And this is also my take on what you need to consider for your own families. So I'm going to tell you, like B.B. King once said, I love to live the life that I sing about in my song. So I'm going to tell you, what you sing about and the life that you live, let them be in concert. I'm Dr. G.O. White, and this is my truth.